The historic hall where the U.S. Constitution was born had never fallen so silent. Broadcast lights beamed down on the podium where some of the nation's most powerful figures had gathered to debate the future of American democracy. It was a live national broadcast. Millions were watching. But no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. A young congresswoman stepped forward completely off script. She wasn't scheduled to speak. She hadn't been introduced. But with steady eyes and a voice that didn't waver, she interrupted one of the country's most senior justices, a woman who had sat on the Supreme Court bench for over a decade. Behind her stood history. In front of her, a wall of institutional power that rarely shifts. And yet, with just one question, Jasmine Crockett brought the entire room to a standstill. She didn't shout. She didn't attack. She simply asked, why are those who endure injustice so often excluded from the conversation about justice? And the person she directed that question to was none other than Justice Sotomayor, a symbol of progress, yes, but also a representative of a judicial system long criticized for being out of touch with the real lives of the people it's meant to serve. As stunned glances filled the room and microphones began picking up the sound of nervous breaths, Crockett didn't flinch. What made the moment extraordinary wasn't her boldness, it was her calm. In a world where people often raise their voices just to be heard, she chose measured silence and undeniable logic to challenge the very institution of American justice. Not with emotion alone, but with lived truth, hard facts, and an unshakable belief that justice doesn't belong to any building. It belongs to people. And that moment didn't just disrupt the conference. It shifted the atmosphere entirely. Because for the first time in a long while, the people weren't just spectators. They had a voice standing uninvited, but unwavering at the center of America's most powerful stage. What happened next is something you'll want to watch until the very last second. Jasmine Crockett's question didn't just stun the room, it hit like a wave crashing against a centuries-old wall of power and decorum. She didn't need a preset microphone. She didn't need a formal introduction. She simply stood up in a room filled with titles, degrees, and authority, and said what many already knew, but few had ever dared to confront out loud. Has the court, the most sacred legal institution in the country, lost sight of the very people it was created to protect? At that exact moment, no one spoke. No one interrupted. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see how Sotomayor would respond. Justice Sotomayor, who once rose from the public housing blocks of the Bronx, who once moved the Senate to silence with her powerful confirmation testimony, was now facing what felt like a younger version of herself. A woman of color. Someone shaped by hardship. But instead of bitterness, she chose the law. She chose the fight. And now she stood here before millions demanding truth from the very institution she once looked up to. Sotomayor's gaze met Crockett's. At first, her eyes were cool, not dismissive, but caught off guard. Perhaps she didn't expect a confrontation to come from someone on the same side, someone who shared her values. But what made the moment electrifying was that Crockett didn't attack. She didn't disrespect. She didn't grandstand. She simply asked a question, one that Sotomayor herself had once posed to the nation when she first took the bench. Can justice truly live within legal texts if it's divorced from lived experience? Crockett reminded the room of a past Supreme Court ruling, one built around the story of a little girl forced to walk miles just to attend school because of segregation. And she asked, if that story had never been told, would justice have ever spoken? And if today a sitting congresswoman cannot bring the stories of her own constituents, those pushed out of the voting system, into the national conversation, then who is the court really protecting? The room no longer felt like an academic forum. It had become a reckoning, a space where the core ideals of the Constitution were being held up and examined under the light of real human suffering. People weren't asking whether Crockett had followed protocol. They weren't debating her standing. They were wondering something deeper. Had the court drifted so far from everyday Americans that it could no longer feel their quiet pain? Justice Sotomayor said nothing at first. She didn't cut Crockett off. She didn't retreat. She listened. She listened like someone being reminded of something she once knew, something she may have temporarily forgotten. Crockett didn't close with a catchphrase. She ended with the oath she had taken upon entering Congress to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And then she said something that echoed far beyond the walls of that room. When a system begins to forget the people it was built to serve, silence is no longer neutral. Silence becomes complicity. In that moment, the entire country watching understood this wasn't just an exchange between two powerful women. This was a reminder that the Constitution isn't a document meant to sit behind glass in a museum. It's a living contract. And each generation must ask itself, are we still honoring that promise? And that was only the beginning. What followed would defy every expectation. The air in the chamber felt heavy after Jasmine Crockett's final words. What she had just said didn't merely brush against the limits of political decorum, it struck at the very heart of a long simmering question. Does an institution like the Supreme Court still truly see the people outside its towering marble walls? And the first voice to break the long silence wasn't a reporter. It wasn't another politician. It was Justice Sotomayor herself. She sat up straight, her hand resting lightly on the polished wooden desk in front of her, and turned to face Crockett. Her gaze no longer carried the weight of being questioned. Instead, it was the look of someone seasoned, someone staring down a truth she had once known well, but may have lost sight of after years of guarding legal principle over human story. She spoke slowly and calmly. Justice, she said, is built not only on legal principle, but on the courage of those willing to demand it. And perhaps in her pursuit of preserving the law's structural integrity, she had neglected the one thing that gives law its soul, the trust of the people. That trust, she added, was what she had once relied on to rise to where she sat today. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was acknowledgement. Crockett didn't interrupt. She didn't lean in. She remained still. Because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about something far more rare, the quiet shift within a centuries-old institution. And in that moment, many in the room realized they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment of truth shared between two branches of government, unfiltered by partisanship or political theater. A single clap rang out from the back of the room, then another. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild. It was contemplative, like a quiet agreement with the courage they had just seen. On social media, the clip of Crockett and Sotomayor facing one another began spreading rapidly. But what made it powerful wasn't just what was said, it was how they said it. No shouting, no interruptions. Just a willingness to listen and to let silence carry meaning. Within hours, major news outlets ran headlines calling it a pivotal moment. A rare public exchange between the legislative and judicial branches, not behind closed doors, but in full view of the people. Law schools began incorporating the video into lectures. A Yale professor called it a vivid example of how citizens don't just have the right to challenge power, they have the obligation to do so with both conviction and grace. 3 days later, a handwritten letter from a high school girl in Chicago was widely shared online. In it, she wrote that, because of that video, she had changed her college plans. She no longer wanted to study biology. She wanted to study law. Not because Jasmine Crockett won the debate, but because she wasn't afraid to ask a hard question in the most powerful room in the country. And that ultimately is the true meaning of the moment. It wasn't about shaking headlines. It was about reigniting democracy's oldest question. Who has the right to speak, and who has the courage to listen? When a young congresswoman stood before a senior justice, and instead of backing down, entered a conversation rooted in honesty that didn't just change the narrative of the day, it made the system pause and examine itself. And that is the real power of words. 4 days after the historic exchange at the Constitutional Conference, the impact of the moment between Jasmine Crockett and Justice Sotomayor showed no signs of fading. Headlines no longer framed politics as a battle between opposing sides. They began using the language of awakening. Some called it a constitutional culture shock. Others described it as a lesson in courage within structure. But there was one point on which nearly everyone agreed: what happened that day couldn't be rewritten, erased, or easily forgotten. At universities across the country, law students weren't just debating the legal substance of the event, they were debating its tone. Some questioned whether a sitting member of Congress should challenge a Supreme Court justice in such a setting. But more often the answer was yes. That moment had reignited one of democracy's core principles, the balance and accountability between branches of government. Because power that cannot be questioned is no longer legitimate. It becomes privilege disguised as authority. In the days that followed, other lawmakers began sharing the video clip, often with captions full of quiet reflection. Many admitted they had become too accustomed to the rituals of formal decorum, forgetting that what voters truly wanted was honesty, not perfection. Slowly, the tone inside Congress began to shift. Not completely, but enough to sense that something new was stirring. Perhaps most striking of all was the shift from within the court itself. In a surprise speech at a judicial conference hosted by the University of Chicago, Justice Sotomayor acknowledged that the exchange reminded her why she chose law in the first place as a young girl growing up in public housing, Bronx. She said that a question asked sincerely in the pursuit of justice does not weaken the authority of the court. On the contrary, it reminds justices that their power is borrowed, and the people are the lenders. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett continued her work as a representative of the people. But now every time she stood to speak in Congress, the way colleagues and reporters looked at her had changed. She was no longer just a sharp-tongued freshman known for tough questioning in hearings. She had become something else, a person who knows how to move from confrontation to conversation. A leader who understands that real change doesn't always come from winning arguments, but from asking the right question at the right time with a purpose rooted in integrity. What remained from that day wasn't just memorable quotes or academic breakdowns or backstage handshakes. It was a clear sense that American democracy, with all its complexity and division, still has the capacity to listen to itself. When people speak with clarity and courage, and when those in power are willing to stop, open up, and rethink, not because they were forced to, but because it's the right thing to do. Ultimately, that moment became a quiet but powerful reminder that in every institution, no seat is too high to listen, no position too secure to be questioned from below. And no time better than now to remember democracy isn't handed down from ivory towers. It is preserved in exchanges like this one, through honesty, through respect, and through hearts that still know how to be moved by another's question. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett all but disappeared from the spotlight. She declined invitations from major primetime shows, stayed silent through waves of interview requests, and offered no statements to the press except for a single post on social media. No hashtags, no self-praise. Just a quiet sentence that read, "I didn't walk into that conference to make a statement. I walked in carrying a question that millions across this country hold in their hearts. If we don't ask, how will we ever know who's truly listening?" That was it. But in its restraint, the message spread even further. In small neighborhoods across Texas, people who had long felt excluded from the political conversation began sharing the video clip like a moment of recognition. In Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities, her words echoed again and again, not because she silenced anyone, but because she made everyone stop and listen. In high school classrooms, teachers began opening civics lessons with the exchange between Crockett and Sotomayor, not to provoke controversy, but to spark thought. They asked their students, who gets to ask the questions? Where does respect end and responsibility begin? Does justice need to be gentle enough to hear unspoken pain? In government offices buried between dry memos and thick budget reports, staffers began pinning a printed quote from Crockett to their corkboards, a quiet reminder that read, "If the people no longer see themselves in the court's decisions, then is the court still theirs?" No one claimed everything had changed overnight. No one believed a centuries-old system could pivot instantly because of one exchange. But something had undeniably stirred. A layer of dust had been lifted off the idea of power. The silence that once acted as a shield was now being challenged by the steady presence of a single honest voice. And for Justice Sotomayor, the days after that moment weren't routine either. She continued her work. She took the bench. She wrote opinions. But in a rare speech at Columbia University the following week, she paused midway, looked directly at the young students before her, and said, "There are times I forget that justice isn't only what we write, it's also how we listen." I was reminded of that not by another judge, but by a young congresswoman who stood up and asked why the people's voices are increasingly filtered out of the places that decide their future. Her words weren't an apology, and they weren't submission, they were recognition. And sometimes in the world of politics, law, and power, honest recognition is more powerful than any apology. Perhaps that above all is what democracy craves most in this moment, not perfection, not theatrics, but truth. And it often begins with a question that seems simple at first. Who is being heard and who is being left behind? 2 weeks after the exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Justice Sotomayor, the echoes of that moment still hadn't faded. But beneath the headlines, beyond the buzz of social media, a deeper question began to surface. A question asked not with hype, but with quiet seriousness. Was that moment just a media flashpoint, or was it the sign of something truly beginning to shift? The question wasn't just coming from journalists or academics. It was coming from within the system itself. A group of young federal judges organized a private session to rewatch the clip, not to critique it, not to praise it, but to ask themselves a difficult question: are we as interpreters of the law still close enough to the lives our rulings affect? One judge, during a short reflection, said something that left the room silent. If we only speak to each other in the language of law, but never hear the voices of real life, then who are we keeping the law for? In the legal community, professional conferences began adding new panels to their agendas, discussing the role of lived experience in legal reasoning. Constitutional law professors debated where emotion ends and logic begins. Some warned that Crockett's arguments were dangerous, too driven by feeling. Others pushed back, arguing that when you strip justice entirely of emotion, it becomes cold, inaccessible, and disconnected from the very people it's supposed to serve. At high schools across the country, sociology classes began including open essay questions. Should citizens challenge institutions of power? One teacher in California shared that her students used to stay silent when discussing politics. But after exploring the Crockett-Sotomayor dialogue, the room came alive. One 11th grader said she had never imagined a woman of color standing in front of a Supreme Court justice without fear. But watching Crockett do it with calm and clarity made her believe she could speak up too, in class, in her family, and someday anywhere she chooses to stand. That, at its core, was the real impact, something no statistic could measure. When one person dares to speak, others begin to believe they can too. And when that belief spreads, systems begin to change, not because of protest alone, but because an aware and awakened public can no longer be ignored. As for Crockett, she returned to her work, attending hearings, drafting policy meetings with constituents. But when asked on a radio program whether she believed she had changed the Supreme Court, she smiled and said, "I didn't set out to change the court. I just hope they'd remember why they exist." Sometimes an institution doesn't need to be shouted at. It just needs to be reminded truthfully. It wasn't a dramatic answer, but it captured the essence of everything unfolding. A mature society doesn't mean everyone agrees. It means people can ask hard questions without fear, and those in power can listen without feeling attacked. In the end, the lesson from that historic moment isn't in how many quotes were shared or how viral the video became. It's in the quiet power of a voice, clear, respectful, and unwavering in a world overwhelmed by noise. And when that kind of voice breaks through, it doesn't just shake an institution. It changes the way society sees justice itself. 3 weeks after the powerful exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Justice Sotomayor, what once seemed like a rare flashpoint in a political event had grown into something deeper, a national conversation with weight and soul. The discussion was no longer centered on a single question, a sharp moment, or the collision of two powerful women. It had evolved into something bigger, a public reckoning with the relationship between people and the law, between human emotion and the institutions designed to serve it. Across the country, people began to ask, if the courts are the final guardians of our civil rights, why do so few citizens ever appear, ever get heard, or ever feel seen in the highest chambers of justice? That question echoed everywhere, in conferences and classrooms and in community town halls across small-town America. People who had once watched politics like a distant spectator sport began to realize they were part of a larger conversation. And in many cases, they found themselves represented by a young congresswoman who chose not to shout, not to perform, but to ask a real question with calm conviction. At a civic event in Atlanta, a middle-aged man stood up, his voice raspy with emotion. He shared that years ago he'd been removed from the voter rolls over a minor administrative error no one could explain. He had written letters, made calls, asked for help, only to be met with silence. But when he saw the video of Crockett speaking directly to Justice Sotomayor, he felt like his quiet outrage had finally found language. Language that power couldn't ignore. For the first time in his life, he said justice felt real, not just a slogan printed on a brochure. These moments of recognition were no longer isolated. Inside lawmaking offices, more members of Congress began seriously considering how to bring everyday citizens into federal hearings, not just as witnesses, but as active shapers of public policy. Some even proposed reforms to judicial hearing procedures. No one claimed these changes were solely because of Crockett's dialogue with Sotomayor, but no one denied that her voice had opened a long-locked door. What stood out even more was that neither woman walked away from that moment. Neither retreated, neither tried to sugarcoat the exchange, but neither allowed the disagreement to become division. Instead, they joined together at a closed-door forum in Washington, where lawmakers and justices met to discuss the bridge or the gap between their worlds. One came from the bench, the other from the chamber floor. But both agreed on one thing: there can be no true balance of power without honesty and dialogue. At that forum, Justice Sotomayor said something many never expected to hear from a sitting Supreme Court justice. She said maybe it's time the judiciary stopped seeing itself as an untouchable fortress and started remembering that listening is part of its job. Because when justice is no longer built on dialogue, it quietly becomes institutional silence. Crockett simply nodded. She didn't need to add anything more. That one gesture was enough. It signaled that their moment wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A hard beginning, but a necessary one that could help institutions survive not just on rules but on trust. And that perhaps is the most profound truth: when those who interpret the law and those who represent the people can sit at the same table, not to defeat one another, but to remember why they were chosen in the first place. Not to rule, but to listen. Not to command, but to co-create a justice that is real. A justice with a face, a justice with a voice, and above all, a justice with a heart. 4 weeks had passed since Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the stage at the Constitutional Conference and looked directly into the eyes of one of the most respected justices on the United States Supreme Court. A month isn't long, but it was long enough to prove that what happened that day wasn't just a flash of media attention. It was the beginning of something deeper, more durable, and harder to erase. In that time, a quiet wave of action had begun to form across the country. In Colorado, a group of young lawmakers launched a series of open justice dialogues gatherings where everyday citizens sat down with legal experts and elected officials to speak openly about the ways they felt excluded from the system. No legal jargon required, no credentials needed, just real experience, real stories, real feelings. In New York, a coalition of law schools and civil rights organizations kicked off a campaign called Law is Human. They brought judges into high schools, paired law students with families navigating the legal system, created space where the law wasn't something taught from a podium but something discussed face to face. Not to lecture but to listen, so that every clause, every ruling, every regulation might be tied to a name, a face, a life. And in Washington, Congress quietly began revisiting a long-stalled bill, one that would require greater transparency in Supreme Court hearings. Lawmakers who had once avoided all judicial reform were now speaking openly about the need for more public access to the federal court system. They didn't all reference the Crockett-Sotomayor moment by name, but everyone knew that was the spark. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett continued with her day-to-day work. She wasn't swept up by newfound fame, nor was she deterred by pressure from the press. She understood that dialogue matters, but the work that comes after it matters more. She kept showing up to voting rights hearings, kept asking hard questions on the floor. And perhaps most significantly, she started hosting small civic trainings for young citizens about how to engage with the legal system. At one of those sessions in Dallas, a young student asked if she ever felt afraid to speak when no one else in the room wanted to hear it. Crockett smiled and replied, "Of course I do. But if I let fear keep me quiet, I'd be no different than an empty chair in a room built for power." That's what many people walked away with in the wake of that moment, not the expectation of a revolution, but the recognition that something had shifted. A door had opened. An unwritten rule that you do not challenge the Supreme Court had been broken, not with rage, but with a question rooted in respect and clarity. As for Justice Sotomayor, she never pushed back. She didn't issue statements to defend her position. She didn't reassert the court's authority. Instead, she responded with presence, more public forums, more conversations with students. And according to a close source, she personally requested a new study on the real-world impact of judicial decisions. That wasn't retreat, that was evolution. And sometimes the most powerful evolution begins with a single question. Who is justice really serving? The exchange between Crockett and Sotomayor didn't end with a win or a loss. It ended with something far more valuable: a beginning. The beginning of conversations this country had been postponing for far too long. And if anything truly changed in the aftermath, it wasn't just the system. It was the way the people saw themselves in the system, not as spectators, but as stewards, reminding every institution of a truth older than the Constitution itself. That power is not inherent, it is granted, and it can be taken back if those who hold it forget who gave it to them in the first place. The second month after the conversation between Jasmine Crockett and Justice Sotomayor came to a quiet, unexpected close. It wasn't marked by a grand event, not by a protest, a media campaign, or a sweeping political statement. It ended with a handwritten letter sent to Congress, written in uneven cursive on a piece of yellow notebook paper, from a 14-year-old boy in New Mexico. He wrote that he didn't fully understand the law. He wasn't sure what the Supreme Court even did. But after watching the video of Representative Crockett and the justice, he said it felt maybe for the first time that someone in a big important room was saying something he had always felt was wrong, but had never dared to say aloud. He shared that his teachers had docked his grades before for asking too many questions, that at times he thought it was better to stay quiet than to stand out, but now he didn't want to stay quiet anymore. That letter in its simplicity was proof of something far larger. When one person dares to speak, hundreds dare to think, and then thousands begin to ask questions of their own. What started in a prestigious conference room had reached far beyond the halls of power to small classrooms, immigrant families, native communities, and neighborhoods where voices had long been seen as background noise. And it didn't happen because Crockett shouted. It happened because she didn't. Because she spoke with the calm certainty of someone not seeking power but clarity. She didn't speak for anyone. She reminded everyone that they could speak for themselves if given the space, if someone was listening and if they believed their voice mattered. And here's what mattered most: Justice Sotomayor listened. Not because she had to, but because she had the courage to understand that power isn't proven by never being questioned. It's revealed in how one responds when they are. When someone standing at the very top of the system chooses to listen to the bottom, that's not weakness. That's when an institution shows it is still alive, still learning, still growing. Their exchange is now used in civic education across the country. Universities have added curriculum, exploring dialogue between legislators and the judiciary. But maybe the greatest impact isn't in lesson plans. It's in the shift in mindset happening quietly throughout society. People are beginning to speak up more. They no longer assume they need a law degree to question the law. They no longer believe that justice is a thing far away. They're starting to demand proximity, not in geography, but in spirit. That's what keeps the moment between Crockett and Sotomayor from being just a passing trend. It became a milestone. Proof that democracy does not live in silence. It needs friction. It needs tension. It needs conversation. But above all, it needs the courage to listen, especially when we disagree. Jasmine Crockett didn't win a debate. She didn't force a justice to change her mind overnight. She did something deeper. She reawakened the belief that the people's voice can reach the highest levels of power. And when spoken with sincerity, even the oldest institutions cannot ignore it. Years from now, we may not remember the exact words she used, but we will remember the feeling they gave us. The feeling that for the first time, someone cracked the invisible wall between the makers of law and those who live under it. Not with force, but with truth. And that's what keeps a democracy alive. Not flags, not framed charters, but people willing to rise not to win the argument, but to defend what's right for everyone. 3 months after the historic exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Justice Sotomayor, what stood out was not the viral video with tens of millions of views, but the quiet persistence of a national awakening. The moment was no longer featured in primetime headlines. Instead, it had quietly woven itself into classroom discussions, policy meetings, community gatherings, and even private conversations within the judicial system. It was no longer an explosion. It had become an echo. At a small community meeting in Birmingham, Alabama, an elderly woman stood to address her city council. She didn't cite legal codes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't hold a protest sign. She simply said, "I don't have a college degree, but I've lived through 6 decades of watching the law not stand on my side. And now I know I still have the right to ask why." No one interrupted her. No one dismissed her. Not because of who she was, but because she represented something. Jasmine Crockett had unlocked a redefinition of the citizen's role in a democracy. Not just a subject of the law, but a keeper of its legitimacy. Inside Congress, younger lawmakers began reaching across party lines to explore new ways to involve the public more deeply before laws are passed. One representative who had previously disagreed with Crockett openly admitted that her moment made them realize something vital. None of us is exempt from answering the people's questions, even when they come at inconvenient times. In law schools, professors started rewriting how they teach. Seasoned faculty revised their syllabi to include a new segment interpreting the law through the lens of the community. No more lifeless exercises on legal precedent alone. Now students were asked to put themselves in the shoes of those affected, to not only analyze the law, but understand its social consequences. At the Supreme Court, the marble walls still stood firm. The rituals remained solemn. But according to several sources, legal clerks had begun drafting briefs in plainer language for public understanding. What had once been deemed unnecessary was now considered worth trying. And back where it all started, Jasmine Crockett continued with her simple, grounded approach. At a small church hall in Dallas, during a town hall meeting, she said, "I don't want to be a symbol. I want to be someone who shows up when you need to be heard, to be understood, and to be protected." There wasn't thunderous applause. But after the meeting, people came up quietly one by one to share their own stories they had once kept to themselves, because now they knew someone was listening. And more importantly, someone was willing to turn their voices into action. 3 months is short in the life of a nation, but sometimes all it takes is a single question asked at the right time, in the right place, by the right person, to reshape how a society sees itself. And if anything still lingers powerfully after those 3 months, it's this simple truth. Justice doesn't live in textbooks. It lives in the courage of those who ask and in the humility of those who answer. And when those two things meet, even for just one moment, an entire system and an entire country can turn a page. After everything that unfolded, from the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped onto a stage that wasn't meant for her to the moment Justice Sotomayor chose to listen instead of push back, one truth stands clearer than ever. In a democracy, no one is too small to speak, and no one is too powerful to be questioned. What happened between them wasn't just an event. It was a living lesson on the strength of kindness, paired with intellect, on the power of dissent wrapped in respect, and on the quiet courage that comes from asking the right question at the right time. Crockett didn't shout at power, she asked. And sometimes a well-placed question shakes more ground than a raised voice ever could. But this story now turns back to you, to all of us outside those marble halls of power. When you see injustice, will you speak? When you see the law forget the people it's meant to serve, will you be the one to remind it? When faced with the silence of institutions, will you turn away, or will you ask the question? No one's asking you to become a member of Congress, or a judge, or a legal scholar. You only need to be what democracy has always depended on: a responsible citizen, one who dares to ask, who's willing to listen, who reminds those in power that they were given that power to serve, not to stand above. If there's one thing you take from this story, let it be this: your voice matters. You belong in the conversation, whether you're in a classroom, a boardroom, or simply sitting alone with a screen in front of you. You are part of this system, and this system needs your voice to grow better. If you believe that questions like Jasmine Crockett's should be heard, if you believe justice should always have a human face, then don't hesitate to share this story. Because every share, every reminder, every new viewer is one more step in pulling democracy a little closer to the people it's meant to serve. Hit that follow button. Because here we don't just tell you what happened. We tell the moments that can shift how you see power, how you see the law, and how you see yourself. In a world full of noise, truth still deserves to be heard. Through reason, through emotion, and most importantly, through your voice.